Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the video, which we're going to talk about the Dutch politics motions that we set at Vienna-pre EUDC. There's a lot of questions about what argumentation you could run in this motion. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the motion in depth and give you a bit more context about Dutch politics. And then show you what the argumentations are that you can bring. Okay, so let's just start with the motion. It is this House believes the assassination of Pim Fortuyn has done more harm than good to the Dutch right. We gave you an info slide about Pim Fortuyn, just so that there's maybe a bit more clarity. So Pim Fortuyn was a gay, populist, anti-immigration right-wing politician. I know it's a lot of words, but I think all this should be quite clear. Populist leader, anti-immigration, who also is a homosexual. And was the leader and founder of the party LPF, which in Dutch stands for Lijst Pim Fortuyn, or if you want to say it in English, List Pim Fortuyn. Yeah, it is that easy. And this was basically created in 2002. Pim Fortuyn saw Islam as an extraordinary threat and as a hostile religion. He was assassinated during the 2002 national Dutch election by Volkert van der Graaf, a left-wing environmentalist and animal rights activist. So I think all of this is information that will just give you a bare-bone idea of, Pim Fortuyn. And everything that we'll talk about now is just a bit more context that happened before and after the assassination. So just that I can sketch out the arguments a bit clearer. So the motion, again, just to be clear, it's about whether or not it is more harm than good to the Dutch right. And that's basically how we'll characterize most of these arguments about the Dutch right specifically. So let's just talk about the context pre-assassination. So this was Cabinet Purple that started as like 1994 until roughly 2002. And Cabinet Purple has three major parties, which is the Labour Party, Partij van de Arbeid in Dutch. This is, of course, a left-leaning party, as you would think. The VVD, which is basically the right-wing largest party, something like the Conservatives, if you think about the UK. So just think of your generic right-wing party. They're the biggest, they're in most coalitions. And then you have a party called D66, which is basically a centrist party, which is, sometimes maybe left-leaning, sometimes maybe right-leaning, depending on the specific policy areas, but overall rather progressive. Just some extra context, Cabinet Purple was also the cabinet that actually made it possible for gay rights and like the gay marriage to become legal in the Netherlands. That's the cabinet that pushed this. And part of this was because they actually had no religious party in the politics. This meant that overall they were able to push for progressive policies, given that these parties are overall progressive. And economically, the Netherlands was doing well. So it was prospering. There weren't any issues with like very bad welfare system. It wasn't an issue with having a lack of jobs. All these things were pretty good. They were overall pro EU integration and were kind of like optimistic about the future and that kind of stuff. They didn't talk much about immigration, so they didn't have a tight stance on that. And even though there was already some groundwork there, and some people thought that there wasn't enough policy about this, which is why Pim Fortuyn, when he stormed onto the scene, he was able to capture a lot of people. Um, this was not very really part of the policies of Cabinet Purple. So again, this is just some characterization. And then basically the thing that happened after was that last Pim Fortuyn, after the assassination, became part of the coalition. And the coalition was with the VVD and the CDA. And CDA is a more religious party. And the VVD was the same big right-wing party, think of the Conservatives, all that kind of stuff. This coalition collapsed, and the LPF also collapsed afterwards. And I think it was the main thing to understand this is that all this happened very, very quickly, right? So in 2002, this was created. In 2002, during that election campaign, Pim Fortuyn was like was assassinated. So the party also kind of like was very new and wasn't very institutionalized. So that suddenly when it becomes really, really big and the LPF becomes so big that it becomes part of the coalition, then it becomes kind of too big for its own good. Because there was no clear follower, so who would be the next actually leader of the LPF? There were factions in it. Politicians didn't know each other well. There wasn't as much of a structure in place on how to do things. So it wasn't necessarily amateurish, but it definitely wasn't a well-structured political party compared to the other political parties. That's also, again, if you have maybe some intuition, why you don't hear anyone talking about the LPF in the status quo when it comes to Dutch politics, but they talk about the PVV. So basically, the coalition and the LPF collapsed because the LPF was basically internally fighting too much, which meant that coalition talks weren't able to really be held consistently. There was disagreements about what happened and who should be assigned where and who should get power and who should not get power. In the end, this was just not stable enough to revolt. So then the coalition fell, and as a consequence, also last Pim Fortuyn fell. Then, basically, after this whole debacle, the PVV rose to prominence, and the PVV is now the main big anti-immigration right-wing party that is there in the Netherlands. This is not just argumentation, and some of this may be a bit more in-depth than you would be expected to know, but I want to use all this context to then maybe explain why the arguments that are going to happen should be somewhat intuitive when you have this context. Then, the general arguments that you can already just think about, even without this context, are things about, for example, you have Pim Fortuyn, which means you would lose him as a specific leader, but you do get him as a like martyr. So you get people who are able to hold that against it. But again, this comes at the specific trade-off of the LPF also falling apart. This is something that you should intuit from the fact that LPF currently isn't talked about in Dutch politics. Most likely meant that they were able, either in the short term or the long term, not be able to create policy or be a good party that is able to remain mainstream. Then you also have, of course, radicalization of the right wing, right? So you get to think about you have all of this anti-immigration policy that suddenly becomes very, very popular, and the main thing is talked about, and you have whole assassination that happens around it, which means this is in the news. This is what people think about. This is where you platform people who may be even a bit more radical in the sense of like, free speech. People get upset about the way that politics have maybe happened and have maybe not talked about like immigration in the first place, and then when someone does talk about immigration, that person is killed, all of that kind of stuff. And then you can say, is this kind of like good capture or is this bad capture? Is this capture that's going to be good for the long term, or will this be something that actually will be destabilizing your policies and all of that kind of stuff? I think those are the kind of like two intuitive clashes that you should kind of know, even if you do not know this kind of context, because it just follows about the fact that this is an assassination that happened and it is very right wing. And that basically then becomes a part of, I think, just any debate that should happen without the context. When you add the context, I think there are more lines that you could run. So this is about immigration becoming entrenched in politics. And I think here you can say that, look, before Pim Fortuyn, Cabinet Purple did not do anything about immigration. They were also pro-EU integration, which means that overall they're very good or fine focusing on like economic policies and not focusing on things like identity politics. Then you can say the immigration as an issue being entrenched in politics is good or bad for the right wing. Good or bad for the right wing. You could say it is good because at the moment that people have something as identity politics, something they become very, very angry about, and they're willing to vote for, and they're willing to donate money to your causes and all that kind of stuff, which means that you're able to mobilize a very large group to be able to vote for you. So you can say this is very, very effective. However, if you also know anything about Dutch immigration policy, it is very hard to actually effectively push through immigration policy that only happens in the Netherlands. And the reason for that is we have kind of underfunded our own kind of like asylum seeker like infrastructure, which means that it just takes a long time for asylum seekers to actually be processed and to hear whether or not they're going to get in or get out. And also once you kind of like kick people out, it's kind of hard because again, you can kick them out of your country, but you kind of like need to kick them outside of the EU because in the EU, you can still travel freely, which means that there's just an issue of all of this free travel that can happen with the EU, which means a lot of the policies that you would actually want to do are just either impossible because you need to do it on the EU level, or some of the immigration is just allowed via just the EU law. So like Polish people can still come to the Netherlands because we just have that free travel that exists. So it's hard to stop these people. You can't really create a lot of like border controls because that's also not really allowed. You can't have like stops or that kind of stuff. So it's really hard for you to kind of push your own immigration policy as a consequence. So you basically have made something an issue, and the right wing wants to solve this issue, but you kind of are unable to solve this. And this is one of the problems that you have with the VVD, which is that they were in power for a long time. They've been talking about anti-immigration policies for a long time, and to a certain extent also PVV. And then when they are in power and they want to actually solve the immigration question, they are unable to via all of these roadblocks. So I think this just only about immigration, you could talk about in depth why or not this is a good policy to talk about in the first place. I also think there's a question you could ask about whether or not immigration is necessarily something that you should really be titled in the first place, in the sense that you could argue that right wing tends to be more defined on economic policies. And you could say for the generic economic policies you would want as a right-wing person, which is deregulations, smaller states, all that kind of stuff. Actually, having immigration is good because that means that companies are more likely to actually have cheap labor. They're able to expand more easily, and you have more competition in the labor market, which means that overall it would be good for your economy to actually accept immigrants in. Which is just another kind of point that you could also talk about whether or not this kind of like policies of what you want in the first place. But again, you could also say that no, as a right-wing party, you also want to go hard on law and order, maybe protecting kind of like your own people and your own culture and all that kind of stuff. And those things are important to you. And therefore, the kind of multiculturalism that would exist when you have a lot of immigration and when you allow a lot of people to come in is something that you do not want to stand for because the right wing is not just its economic aspects. It's not just talking about direct also kind of stuff. It's also just about the kind of like identity politics that are tied to right wing ideas. So it is about protecting your culture, having a law and order, having like a social contract with the state that is specific. Like you also have responsibility towards the state and all of the kind of stuff. And then you could say because the state has so much invested in you, you ought to give back to that. And because immigrants are not in the first part, not really adding much in the beginning. Because they might need integration when it comes to exam seekers, all the kind of stuff, they would be maybe overall worse off this. Again, you could flip this characterization and say, no, actually, immigrants tend to be net contributors in form of like taxes and all the kind of stuff. But I think that's the kind of other clash that you can have under this immigration, whether or not this is something that you would want to focus on in the first place. Um, Again, even if you do not know about Cabinet Purple not talking about this issue in the first place, I do think you could intuitively understand that when, again, someone is assassinated about this becomes one of the main issues and becomes really, really big. Even if it would become big, either way, again, some might argue, you could say this is really the thing that gave it a lot of attention and really drowns out other right-wing things that you might want to focus on, such as economic policies, and that kind of stuff, or the law and order kind of politics that you would want to run. Okay. The other thing is kind of like martyrdom versus collapse of the party. So again, you could say it's very good because martyrdom, this means that you're able to platform a lot more right-wing people, especially directly after the assassination. It just means that people also have someone to look up to. This is like inspiring people like, yes, we should hold a stand, all that kind of stuff. You could also, of course, demonize the left because Volkert van der Graaf was a animal activist and like left-leaning. The reasons for his assassination are actually never published. Like he never actually talked to the media about why he did what he did, which makes it actually quite interesting. But you can definitely say that this just leads to a lot of political power that you give to the right to just assassinate the left politically and to make themselves just look like the victims and get off sympathy. And I think, again, the opposite of this, yes, this is true. But when you have so much attention and you have a party that is just very newly formed and it collapses, this just fractures the right. And I think here the fracturing of the right, you could say, is bad for a lot of reasons, because it just means that, for example, coalitions are harder to form. So we have a lot of like small right-wing parties that need to now create an identity about identity politics and immigration. What happens as a consequence is they want to stand out. How do you stand out? It's oftentimes becoming more extreme. So you make more extreme statements about asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, all of this kind of stuff. And then you can say the issue of that is mainstream parties might be willing to work with someone who's conservative on, immigration and wants to be strict with this. But most centrist people in their main parties would not want to work with someone who's as extreme. Therefore, when you have this much fracturing within the right, it just makes it harder for you to actually have a full right-wing coalition, which means that you get more right with some center parties, e.g., with the D66 or with the Christian Union, which have more left-leaning policies in certain aspects, such as spending money for education, still having the state intervene in more and more things. And you could say these are less in the interest of right-wing people, because again, this is not the kind of policy you in general want to go to. You could again characterize what the interests are. You could say the majority of people who are right are, even if they are center, there's also just a large group that's to the right. And if it becomes centrist, then, it's centrist and not the right wing, so that we don't care about that. So the kind of parties that get represented are a group of people that we don't care about, and that kind of stuff. So I think that would also be things about the policies you could talk about. Okay, just one more thing, by the way, about the collapsing of the party. I like the martyrdom. Another thing you can say is that it does allow you to also push maybe through a couple of policies that are a bit more law and order and more protecting and shrinking, like entrenching your right to maybe make more radical statements as a right-wing person. And then you can say this also gives you more leeway and more benefits to actually be able to defend multiple stances and not need to be afraid of the pushback or not be afraid of being censored and all that kind of stuff, which gives you more leeway to talk about policies in different ways, but also be able to actually antagonize people and to blame people, or you yourself will not be held accountable by institutions. So, for example, who might limit hate speech and that kind of stuff, or get prosecuted by courts because of what you were saying. That's also another point you could talk about what happens with the martyrdom and why this also leads you to having more flexibility, and that's good for you electorally, but also just strategically, because you're allowing that more for yourself. But you can also limit that more to the left, because you can say, look, this was an animal rights activist. The left has kind of led to this maybe this bubble and this formed this kind of like hate, and this is why this person has assassinated a right-wing person. So you can kind of like say a laws for thee, but not for me kind of sphere that you can create. Again, no, this is the Netherlands, so you can't go like full corruption, full like completely locking out parts and that kind of stuff. But I think this is more about how much leeway do you get within the media, within the justice system, and again, maybe courts being a bit more hesitant to prosecute you because of the optics they would know would happen. Okay, and now it becomes to I think a very interesting comparative, and this is the PVV versus the LPF. So the PVV only came to be after assassination. So I think it is roughly around 2004 to 2006 that the PVV was created. And the assassination happened in 2002. And in 2003, the coalition had already collapsed. And then the LPF basically ceased to be. And if you know anything about the PVV from, again, maybe just looking it up, or maybe from my YouTube series, which is about Dutch politics, you would know that the PVV is basically just left-leaning. Everything it does is just quite left-leaning. So it's willing to cut taxes and maybe have less money that people have to pay, but it also wants to do a lot of things like pay more money for healthcare. Just want to have free universal healthcare. Wants to have like more money for education. Wants to put more money into like infrastructure and roads and all that kind of stuff. Um, and you could say this just means that it is basically just a left-leaning-ish party. That has a lot of like politics that are kind of weird. But the LPF is interesting because it's actually neoliberal. So at least Pim Fortuyin as a person was neoliberal. So it was still in favor of, for example, again, gay rights and secularism and all that kind of stuff. So it was progressive. So still thought in that sense like we should protect gay rights. Again, he was gay. That's arguably the intuition you can run here. Um, and then you could say a lot of other things was very neoliberal. So wants to actually have a smaller state, wants to have the state spend less, all the kind of stuff. And I think here you could talk about why this is good in the form of coalition forming. Again, the PVV has had a very hard time becoming part of coalitions. So at some point there was a coalition with the PVD, so the big right-wing party, and the CDA, the more conservative right-wing party that's big. And they formed together, technically a minority cabinet, and they basically needed the PVV to get a majority. Because any other coalition they just didn't want to do because it would be with too many left-leaning parties, or just will not be able to get the policies done effectively because there would be too many small parties. So they kind of like worked together with the PVV, but the PVV was not technically part of the cabinet. Why? Because the PVV was not only too extreme, but also in its policy was just quite left-leaning. It was kind of like inconsistent, and it's something that the VVD and CDA could work less with because it's not as much right wing. It's kind of like right wing on Texas, but also wanting to spend a lot of things. Because again, PV is very like we give direct benefits to you. We stop the immigrants. You have to pay less for housing. You have to pay less for healthcare, all of that kind of stuff. At least you could say with list Pim Fortuyn, it actually means that you are more able to actually have more of these coalitions because these are actually more right wing. So the VVD and CDA are more willing to actually discuss this kind of like policies and politics and that kind of stuff. Um, Another thing that you could talk about though here is the kind of like democratic structure. And the PVV, again, if you know a bit about the PVV, you know that it's very dictatorial. So this means that everyone who's inside of that party doesn't take part of discussions, doesn't take part of parliamentary discussions, only Geert Wilders. Um, very few people are actually able to decide what the election campaign is on. They don't talk to the media except for Geert Wilders. They always just say, just follow what Geert Wilders is saying. You have to ask Geert Wilders, that kind of stuff. So it's very anti-democratic. And you could say, overall, this is good because this is overall able to stop manufacturing, except for last, year when one of the parties split off. But you could say it would be worse on the other side, because on the other side, the LPF was clearly democratic and was clearly consistent of people who were able to voice their own opinion within the party, which meant that it would be more democratic and therefore more likely when there is going to be actual discussions and disagreements that don't get resolved the way it wants, that you actually get more fracturing that happens more quickly, which means the LPF will maybe be more unstable and more unpredictable, which is kind of like the LPF failed after the death of Pim Fortuyn, but it would likely have happened anyways because of its kind of like radical positions anyways, like of like its mishmash that happens afterwards. Then you could say as well on the PV, it's kind of like the democracy is also like a bad thing because you could say the issue with the PV is it's kind of like now a one person show and just one person giving their opinion, their perception. And yes, it might speak to a lot of people, but clearly it would be more representative if more people would be able to have their say. When you maybe also have more local politicians who are able to have their own discussion or like feedback towards the party where they can talk about, yes, but in my did you see one of the issues as well is that we have a lot of things with farming and that kind of stuff. So why don't we also put this policy into our like plan when we have coalition talks and that kind of stuff? And that would happen more with the LPF. So you could also say that actually becomes more representative, more democratic, which is good, either in form of if you get coalitions and they get into some power, they are better off. But also you could say even if they don't get into power or equally into power, it's about what kind of opposition can you do? How can you point out the issues within policies? How are you going to try to maybe amend policies? All of that kind of stuff. Are you going to maybe make your own proposals? What will be in attention in the media? All of that kind of stuff. And I think here again, you could talk about the benefits that could happen as a consequence of that to the right. And I think this can be not just policies, but also just perception of politics in of itself. And how do you feel represented or not? And you can say these are important things that people do care about on the right, right? So you are a right-wing person. You want your policies to be implemented and you want yourself to feel represented in democracy. And therefore, this is just a better feeling that you have. And that is another thing that you could talk then about within these parties. There's this kind of like specific trade-off between the policies. Um, and that's basically a lot of other characterization. I think this is again, if you go even into more depth, there are maybe even more arguments that you could think of when it comes to comparing the PVV and the LPF when it comes to kind of like policies and that kind of stuff. But I think these are already, I think, good starting points that you can go from and kind of like explains why that could potentially be a debate winning argument. And then lastly, you can also talk about Geert Wilders versus Pim Fortuyn. Again, you could say that Geert Wilders specifically, uh, like they have different debating styles. Geert Wilders isn't necessarily anti-LGBTQ plus, like he doesn't make any like arguments about trans people in sports or saying that gay people are disgusting. Things like the same kind of idea of like, oh, we need to protect our gay people from Islamic people because they're going to beat them up and all the kind of stuff. And Pim Fortuyn did the same, but of course, Pim Fortuyn being gay, you could say at least means that there's a identity part of it, which kind of like entrenched and also became something that he used within these discussions and debates to kind of also create disgust in the other politicians, where they talked about like some sexual stuff with like partners that Pim Fortuyn had. It's kind of like way to throw off the politicians in debates. And I think here you could argue about the qualities of both these people. I think the intuitive things like Pim Fortuyn would have become big in the alternative because it was the first party that the first mover advantage. It's the first person who really talked about these kinds of things and already was rising within the election. I think it would have been hard to see that someone else would really swoop Pim Fortuyn. So I think that's why this is the comparative. And then you could say then Pim Fortuyn at least has these characteristics, right? So because the fact that, for example, he was homosexual, that also means that people who might have normally maybe a bit more of an feeling of maybe they are gay, but they're also right wing, and they might also feel, for example, that they're not being protected enough, and they are, for example, fearing Islam and multiculturalism and like safety on the street and that kind of stuff. They're more likely to also have these people vote for Pim Fortuyn, whereas Geert Wilders isn't again anti-LGBT. He's also not very visually pro or doesn't have that same signaling effect. So you could say that these people are having a very different kind of way of catering to people. And this means that Pim Fortuyn, for example, here has the edge on Geert Wilders on this kind of like identity politics. And Pim Fortuyn also was a bit more like highly educated, was a bit more eloquent in his word usage. Geert Wilders, on the other hand, is actually more direct. And of course, knows debating because he's been in uh, the VVD, like the very big right wing party, for a very long time. He's actually taught and mentored Mark Rutte, was the In the end, the main leader of the VVD for a long time and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for a long time is now the head of NATO. So like clearly he is also someone who knows about debating and politics and all that kind of stuff, but just has a more direct style and just therefore it's also a bit more simpler. So you could also argue that Geert Wilson has the benefit of actually capturing people who have been hurt by labor more easily. So the people who are, for example, poor, people who used to be like laborers, had like hard jobs, all that kind of stuff, who kind of like have need easy messaging, easy things like my house needs to be cheaper. I fear immigrants coming into my areas. I fear them taking my jobs, all of the kind of stuff. Those are more likely to actually go to Geert Wilders. And therefore, these are different people that you could cater to as a consequence as well. I think this might be a bit more of a harder clash. Again, this characterization is part of thing, partly depends on knowing the empirics and to a certain extent being able to prove it. But I do think this is also just an interesting dimension that you could maybe even add towards the PVV versus the LPF clash that maybe just edges out some of the clashes on which party is better and why, which has a broader reach than the other and why, and that kind of stuff. Okay, so this was basically everything I wanted to talk about. This was a hard motion. I think if you would set this in the Netherlands within Dutch, uh, within Dutch teams, I think they'd be able to come up with some of these points if they have a bit of knowledge about this. If people have actually studied this and know a bit more, I think a lot of these points would become more accessible. But I hope this shows at least enough about Dutch politics and also the Dutch right in a lot of ways. So why is it that specific policies might be implementable or might not be implementable? E.g., why are we still struggling with immigration in status quo? What does actually the right still talk about in the wake of like Pim Fortuyn's assassination? What is actually the characterization of the right and the current state of the right-wing parties, like the fracturing that happened there, but also again specifically the PVV and why PVV is such a kind of odd duck in Dutch politics, specifically the Dutch right, and also maybe a bit more about Geert Wilders specifically and how he was shaped along the way and his party was shaped as a consequence of the LPF. Because don't forget, the PVV became dictatorial because it saw, or it became like it just always started as a dictatorial party because it saw LPF collapsing because of the fact that they didn't have a strong leader and they didn't have strong rules about what would happen within the party. So yeah, that's this. If you have any questions about this motion or about this testing or about the context, put it in the comments. I'll try to respond. And good luck for Euros. Bye.